Welcome to episode 9 of Community as a Verb, a show that talks about the tools for social action. Here we talk about social media, systems, processes, and strategies, and what we're doing to create the world we want to see. My name is Connor Kaysen, your co-host here at Community as a Verb, and next to me, via the powers of the internet, is my distinguished co-host, Mr. Well-Traveled. Mr. Well-Traveled, Merry belated Christmas, Happy Kwanzaa, Happy Holidays, Happy New Year's, all those good things. How are you doing? What's been going on with you?
Hey, Connor. Doing well. No complaints. Excited to have finally arrived to the end of 2020 and looking forward to 2021. I mean, gosh, it's been quite a year, and we're going to talk about that. But as I look back on it, a lot has happened, and I have to say, just having gotten through this year with my health, my continued employment, and really seeing everyone around me continue to really do well throughout a really challenging year. I feel like there's a lot to feel good about and to look forward to going into 2021. How about you?
Yeah, I agree. I feel the same way. I think there are offline. We talked about this a little bit, like the year, a big scope, it got a lot of negative headlines, but trying to focus it on but there's some good things that happened on an individual basis. And so since we saw you 2 weeks ago, and what's been going on in your life the last 2 weeks?
Oh, good question. Let me think. I wouldn't say there has been a lot that's happened, on nothing too exciting. We had a really interesting, I was trying to think of how to put it. So I don't know if I mentioned with the Next Up app, we applied to Apple's Entrepreneur Camp for Black founders and developers. And I had a phone call about that within the last couple of weeks. It was not an acceptance. So I just want to be clear, but it was a good phone call, just sort of, talking about the application and what we're trying to accomplish. So I'm hoping to hear about that in 2021, that there's yes, you guys get to participate in this camp. That would be awesome. I feel like, we're going to continue to build upon that. That was a great foundation. And I think going into 2021, there's a midterm election in 2022. So 2021 is the year to really take Next Up City Guide voter to a different level. And I think that's been on my mind a lot. Also working on, other projects, this podcast, and also spending time trying to learn more and really prepare to take on the year in a different way than this year. This year, I think I came into 2020 with a lot of plans, but the pandemic was not one of them. Now, pandemic is a part of my thinking. And so I've been spending a lot of time just, working on what am I looking to accomplish in 2021?
Yeah, thinking about the pandemic kind of in your planning is very interesting. That's this was something that was now part of all of our lives. And now at least the ones of us that are working from home are lucky enough to have that position. I guess everyone, though, is, all right, the pandemic's not going anywhere, right? Coronavirus is part of our daily lives. And so how do we plan that in our New Year's resolutions and our goals for the upcoming year is very interesting. Every time we do the show, I'm thinking back to the 2 weeks, and time has gone by so fast. I think back to March and April, and everything seemed to slow down at that time because there was so much unknown. But now that routines have been established more, especially with the holidays that have now come and gone, it's interesting how quickly 2 weeks, it just snapped by for me. And the fact that we are here, it's Saturday, December 26th now, is just wild to think about, right? Think about what New Year's is going to be like, how it was different from last year. Christmas yesterday was just so different for my wife and I from previous years. Just being at home, I didn't even go outside for Christmas. I just stayed inside and watched Netflix all day. And just, I mean, we started the show this year as well, right? And the show is something that I know you and I are both very proud of. So many different changes and things. And right now is a great time just to be reflecting on all those things that have happened. And so that's kind of our goal of this show today, right? We're going to go through we've kind of designed it like quarter by quarter of the year to reflect on some of the big topics that we have looked into, that you and I have discussed immensely over the year, and just discuss how things change. And then we'll end the episode kind of talking about a transition into 2021 and what some of the themes are that we see coming up for next year, which will probably be cornerstone topics over the 25 episodes that we end up doing in 2021.
Yeah, I think that's a good setup for where we need to go. So let's jump in a time machine for a second and let's go back to January 2020. All right. How did you spend your New Year's? Do you remember? I can't even remember what New Year's Day was like. I have no memory of it.
I remember New Year's last year because we had this crazy windstorm that happened here in Seattle. And okay. I live right across the street from the Space Needle. So the Space Needle for the last couple of years has like always been what New Year's Eve was all about for me. And they canceled the fireworks show last year because the wind was so high. So I remember New Year's Eve being really uneventful because the Space Needle still did like a light laser show with music, but it was very uneventful compared to not when you don't have the fireworks. And I remember there was this weird moment, and Amanda reminded me, I had just bought a drone, maybe during that like Black Friday time. And I wanted to fly my drone above my apartment to film the fireworks of the Space Needle. And it was super windy. And at like 11:50, when I'm trying to fly the drone, I crashed the drone because it was so windy. And so it's like 11:55 p.m. I crashed my drone like into my apartment building and it fell to the ground outside. And I ran out of my apartment to go catch the drone, and I actually missed the New Year's countdown because I was going and retrieving my drone. And so I'm like running through my apartment complex, and I can hear my apartment going 10, 9, 8. And so Amanda likes to joke that in 2019 I ran out on her. In 2020 I came back in because I like missed that like brief moment. And then it's funny, I didn't even make the connection, but she was making fun of me for it yesterday and was like, look what you did to 2020, Connor. Like you had to ruin New Year's Eve, and then which not ruin it wasn't that big of a deal, but like you that happened, and then the rest of the year like fell all apart. And so it's funny to think back on, but I will remember that day very vividly because it was just stupid idea for me to think I'm going to fly my drone and it'll sit there. We'll do the countdown and I'll get this fireworks show. And it did not turn out that way. What about you? What was your New Year's Eve like?
I don't remember it at all. Like, I have no memory of it. I remember the calendar changed. I remember that much. I don't remember what I did or what happened. I was thinking, though, the thing that I do remember, I was looking actually at some of my videos from around this time last year, and I realized, do you remember that the drone, the funny thing that you bring up the drone, on Christmas Eve last year, we flew the drone, and I was so afraid to try to like fly it because we flew it over Lake Washington, right?
Yep.
And I was so afraid because there were eagles out there, I remember, and I'd never flown a drone before, and I was like, oh my gosh, I don't want to crash the drone. It's not my drone. And then now I hear the story that you crashed your drone. I feel a little better. I'm like, well, I didn't crash it. It wasn't me. So I was looking at those videos like, wow, yeah, that was a year ago. It feels like forever. And I think that's the thing, right? Coming back to that first quarter, so much happened, and the things that stand out on my mind are the things that are related to the pandemic, interestingly enough. So for me, I actually came to I was in Seattle. So I started the year in Seattle, and then I came to Texas, and that was when I had my first meeting. I went to Austin and had my first meeting with DeMarcus, and we were talking about Next Up, and that was when we had a different use case for Next Up, and we had our meeting there, and I remember that a lot because that was early on in January, and I remember the pandemic being in the background, but no one was calling it a pandemic at that point. I think it was just, there was this virus that was kind of out there in the world. I don't think at that point we were talking about it as having arrived in Seattle, but it was very shortly after that, or somewhere around there, where the first case was announced in Everett. And Everett, Washington is in the same county where I work. So it was kind of, I think at that point, it was kind of like, wow, it's here, it's close by.
That's very close.
But life was going on. Like, no one did anything different, right? We weren't wearing masks. We were still going out places. And so I was thinking a lot about, that was January for me. I did a great, one of the fun things I got to do was a great family photo shoot, since we didn't get to do a Christmas photo shoot in December because I was in Seattle in December. And so then we did it in January, and it was so much fun. The same photographer I worked with for the Next Up photos, we did photos at my grandmother's house. And so, January, that's the memory that stands out in my mind. But then February was really cool because I got to go to Vancouver twice, and I love Vancouver. What else happened? Oh, I did have a chance to come hang out in Texas, and by that point, the pandemic had really become prominent in the news. And on my way back to Seattle, the first death happened that same day. So this was maybe February. We had a leap year this year, so maybe this was February 28th or 29th, something like that. And I knew at that point that things were going to change. But I just didn't understand how much and how quickly, but I knew that was very significant. The interesting thing that was happening in Houston, though, that same week was that there was a water line that burst and flooded a freeway, and the city, the whole time I was here, had no water.
Wow.
Yeah, it was crazy. And so you would see Starbucks, and they were open. I remember I went to Starbucks twice, and they had no water, so they couldn't make coffee. And people would just walk in and walk out and walk in and walk out because they didn't know that they couldn't serve any drinks. And it was a wild thing. And that was actually more prominent than the pandemic. But I remember at that same time, that same week, cities in Europe were shutting down. And I remember talking about that with my family because I thought, oh, yeah, that's happening over there. That was what was in my mind. I was like, that's happening over there. Over here, that's not a thing. We're living life. And, it's interesting because I flew on a plane. I took the Amtrak to Vancouver at one point when I'm in February. And to think that those are not things I did again after that, and I can't even imagine when I'm going to do them again. That, January, February, the year started off, I had all these big travel plans. One of them being your wedding in March. And I try to go to Brazil at least once a year. And so I was in March planning the rest of the year, thinking about all the trips I was going to take. I wanted to go to Canada again. And well, we know the border is still closed. Okay. So yeah, I mean, January, February, and then March, the beginning of March. I'll stop at the beginning of March because after that's when things really change. But, coming back to work after the first death, things were still pretty normal on Monday. By the time we got to Thursday, though, that first week, this is the first week of March, it was really clear that things were changing around us because people stopped showing up to work. There were every day there were fewer and fewer cars in the parking lot. And I used to go to the grocery store like regularly. And I remember I was at the grocery store, like maybe that was the Monday after the first death. And I walk over, I was looking for like the paper products, and I see this guy like clearing off the shelf of toilet paper. And he's just looking at me and I'm looking at him because I'm trying to understand, like, what is happening here? What is he doing? Why is this happening? And he like gets like a ton. I mean, I don't know, maybe like 10 rolls of toilet paper. It was a lot. And he walks off, and I started thinking to myself, well, maybe I should get some. So I got some extra toilet paper. But I remember at that point, that was a thing, right? Like the toilet paper flying off the shelves. And I remember joking about it with people at work. I had no idea how bad it would get.
Yeah. And I wasn't here for that like early moment. Let's stop there before like the shutdown happened, and then we'll go into after the shutdown. So I was very much on top of the coronavirus very early on because we had this wedding planned in Bangkok in the middle of March. So when it started to become at least major news in Asia in early January, it was very much on our radar. And the whole time planning the wedding was like, well, we're still going, we're still planning to go, but it was always the fear of we are going into coronavirus. There really wasn't this like big, like, oh, the virus was already here and this is actually like a much bigger thing. And I remember it was on February 29th on leap year was the opening match for the Sounders game or for the Sounders season this year. And so I had my friends kidnapped me that weekend for my bachelor party, and we went to the Sounders game on the 29th. And thinking back to that day, I was like, man, I sat in this stadium on February 29th with 50,000 people cheering and high-fiving and hugging, and like not even a care in the world about what was going to happen. I know on that weekend, we kind of joked about it. Like, oh, like if one of us has it, like we're all going to have it kind of thing, but still not like it was still a joke, right? It wasn't like taking it all that seriously. And then we left on March 1st to go to Thailand. And yeah, everything kind of changed from that day that we got in Thailand. And when we flew to Asia, it was very, very it wasn't a shock. We knew what to expect. Like we bought N95 masks in, it was, I believe, the same weekend as Valentine's Day. We were up in the Tukwila area because we were out playing bingo at the bingo hall. That's one of our old hobbies. And we were up in Tukwila, and we knew that N95, like people were starting to like think about buying those. And we happened to go to Home Depot and we found them. And at that time, we were like, oh, we got to buy these masks. So when we go to Asia, we know that masks are required and we need to wear it to protect ourselves, right? It was like, we need these filtered masks to protect ourselves. And I remember flying to Taiwan, and right when we got to Taiwan, it was like, all right, mask up. Right. It was the first time like we were putting on the mask and wearing it. And the whole time, pretty much from that moment on, mask was a part of life, except for like a very brief moment when we came back to Seattle at the end of March. When we got to the airport, like nobody was wearing a mask. There was no expectation. None of the security guards had masks. It was a very big switch when we got back in that time. But I want to transition back to you. So first couple months, you're kind of living, let's just call it stress-free from the COVID anxiety that we've all developed.
Stress-free.
So what was it like during the shutdown? What was March like for you to think back about, like, all restaurants were closing down, work from home was mandatory, like everything shut down?
Yeah. It's interesting. So the week following the first death, so by Thursday evening, my team at work, we all made the decision that we were going to work from home on Friday. Friday evening, we all get an email saying, don't come back. We're going to be working from home for, well, actually, it didn't say don't come back. It just said don't come in on Monday. That was, sorry. So we understood at that point it was don't come back because we had already decided to work from home. But that Monday, we were told we would be working from home for 2 weeks. And so I thought, great. And I actually enjoyed it. It took some getting used to, but I was waking up at the same time, but then I didn't have a commute. So I'd go and get a coffee, I'd come back, and I realized that I could do other things during that time that before I started work. And I was glued to the news, like constantly. That's all that I cared about from the time I woke up to the time I went to sleep. I was constantly just on SeattleTimes.com, CNN, you name it. I was just trying to get as much information as I could, because at that point, things were changing so quickly, and you needed to stay on top of what was going on, because you wouldn't know, like, is there going to be a curfew, or when are they going to shut something down? And everything was just happening so quickly. So you would stay on top of the news. I mean, I'd stay on top of the news, but then I would also talk to everybody else that I knew to find out, did you hear this? Did you hear that? Did you, what's happening in your neighborhood? So all of those kinds of things. And when I would talk to family and friends in Texas, they weren't having that experience at all, because at that point, Texas didn't have very many cases. So their experience was still like my January, February experience. And we are in the middle of, I think that at that point they're calling it the epicenter. So it was like,
we're the epicenter. That was crazy.
Yeah. It was a totally different world, right? So we had the first death, and case count was just through the roof because there was an outbreak at one of the senior centers. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there was a lot happening at that point. So those first 2 weeks, I have to say, I still didn't think that it was as big of a deal at that point, because I thought, well, we'll just be working from home until the end of the month. We'll go back to work in April. Everything will be good. But that's not what happened. I will say with work, it was really nice because I got to work from home and our technology was smooth. Like, we had no tech issues the whole time. So I felt like that was really stable, and there was just nothing like I had to worry about. I just open my laptop and continue things as usual. I got to take walks during the day, which was not something that I did before. I got to enjoy Capitol Hill in a way that I hadn't before. Going to local coffee shops. Like, I didn't know what Capitol Hill looked like during the daytime. Like, there was so much construction. There were so many people out. I thought that people would be mainly like indoors, but there were a lot of people out. And of course, masks still weren't a thing yet. And I was still going inside of Starbucks, and you could still sit down at that point. And I remember when Starbucks sent its workers home, I remember talking to one of the baristas, and she said, I wish that I could work from home. And I thought about that. And for the first time, it kind of clicked in my mind that, oh, right. There's some of us who get to work from home. And then there are others who are not ever going to have that opportunity because their jobs are not designed that way. And so while I'm having this great work from home experience, here's someone who's feeling anxious, coming back to the, COVID anxiety. Here's someone who's feeling very anxious about this situation. And there's nothing, she doesn't have that, ability to work from home like I do. So I'm not feeling super anxious about it in the same way she is.
Yeah.
So, that's when we started hearing about essential workers, right? And I think from then on, I started to become a lot more aware of what does it mean to be a work from home. I call it work from homer, a work from homer versus an essential worker, because so much of my experiences after that, the people that I was interacting with, they were essential workers. The people who delivered food to me, the people who delivered packages to me, like the people who were working in the places that I went through drive-through, those were my, human interactions. And it became pretty clear to me that there was a big difference in what their experience was versus my experience. And so I thought a lot about that. I was still holding out hope, I have to say, that I was going to get to travel, because in this same month, you had your wedding, and I was so excited. I had some trouble with the plane ticket and all of that, because my first flight was canceled by the airline. My second one, then I canceled because as it got closer to time, to go. And this was towards the end of March. I felt like I was going to have a lot of trouble getting to Thailand and then getting back because I was flying Delta and Korean Air. And the route was from Seattle to Seoul.
And I think at this time, Seoul was like the new hotspot.
Yeah.
It was that Italy and Seoul were like the two places that everyone was very concerned about.
That was the thing, right? And because things kept changing so quickly, the restrictions that were put in place there, from flying from the US to there, then flying from Seoul to Bangkok, it made it, for me, I just didn't think it was going to work out well. And I thought I was going to get trapped in a quarantine situation because there were restrictions on flights coming into Bangkok from Seoul. So if I had flown another route, like say through Hong Kong, I didn't see the same restrictions at that point in time. So I canceled the flight, but that was probably one of the easier. Well, I should say that wasn't actually one of the easier things. That was actually pretty tough because I couldn't get Delta on the phone. I actually had to drive to the airport and get them to cancel the flight. That's what I did.
I did not know that.
Yeah. I could not get them on the phone. And for the first flight, I booked it through one of those online travel brokers, which I'll never do again because I actually didn't get my money back until August. So for a flight that was canceled, I didn't cancel it. They canceled it. The airline canceled it in February. I didn't get a refund until August. So, and I had to keep calling to get it.
That time was so crazy with flights because we had 120 traveling RSVPs to come to Bangkok. And so I think it was like that March 12th date was when I'm not sure who actually declared it. It was declared a global pandemic, right? Mm-hmm. And that's when like everything shifted. I remember it was nighttime here. And in Bangkok, it was the morning, like we had just woken up. And that seemed like every day we would wake up and America had their whole day and we'd wake up and we just have like a flood of messages of like, here's the new things that are going on in America, or messages from people. And it was like right when it was named pandemic, it was like everything switched, right? And that's when people were like, I probably shouldn't be going to Asia right now. I shouldn't be traveling at all. And the fear was, the quarantine, right? There were so many different changes of information. Like every day it was like, oh, you got to spend a 2-week quarantine. Oh, we're not even going to let you on the plane. Right. And like every country had its own messaging that was come out and its own restrictions. And obviously the airlines had no clue what they were doing. I mean, thinking back with all the people we've talked to, right? How many people had flights booked for that and how many people had to get refunds? And then you multiply that by the global travel. I mean, just us managing our flights when we were in Thailand was such a mess and just crazy to think about that we were there. It was very weird, especially with my job being so hyper local focused and so restaurant focused. To be in Asia for the month of March was very weird. Actually, when I got home, felt very disconnected from what happened. And it's actually like been an ongoing struggle for me to feel the connection that the business are going through because I just like wasn't there. Right. Like it was very weird for those 3 weeks to not be here when everything was getting shut down and all the rules were changing. And I remember watching like on Instagram stories, people like going out to restaurants or being like, hey, the restaurants are shutting down tomorrow. Like, let's all go hang out and get a beer at the bar. And just feeling like, oh, I'm not, this was like my moment to help support the community. And I'm like, not even there. I'm like out, like eating noodles on the street right now. It was very just a weird time in general to be consuming all that information and be somewhere else and be in a country that was very close proximity to to Wuhan, right? Where the center was. And Thailand at that point had already kind of dealt with their initial outbreak and had seized it. And they didn't have no positive cases in like the month leading up to when we got there. So we felt like, I think they've got it taken care of. And when we were there, I felt safer in the 3 weeks I was in Thailand than pretty much I felt in America for the last 9 months. Wow. It was very interesting because right when we got there, that was when I learned we were on a subway or train and the train was packed. Mask wearing was 100%. And there was a video that played on the train and it was a graphic that clearly was not made during the pandemic. Like this has been a normal thing. And it was like, please always wear your mask, the mask. And they had a graphic of an old woman and a child. Right. And it was like, the mask is to protect this old woman sitting next to you. Right. And that's for like, not just coronavirus, but like for your cold or for a fever or anything you've got going on, that you could pass on to that person. Like mask wearing has been adopted in Asia and been for years a normal thing. And so that's when we saw it, where it was like, oh, we had this phrase while we were there was, in Asia, everyone wears a mask. And if you're not wearing a mask, people look at you weird and think that you're spreading the virus or spreading your germs. In America, it was exact flipped, right? If you were wearing the mask, people looked at you weird and thought that you were the one sick and spreading the virus. And it was very interesting to look at that dichotomy of both. And that's when it was like, oh, like this mask thing is different than what we expected, right? Like I said earlier, we wore the mask thinking we were protecting ourselves. And very quickly it was like, oh no, it's to protect other people. And just our ignorance though of that trip when we were there, like on my wedding, right? Like we didn't all have masks on at my wedding. And the wedding was 2 parts, a morning and an evening. And there were people that were working there, like at the hotel and everything, and they had masks on the whole time. And I just think back, like, man, it was such a weird thing for all of us Americans to be there and not have masks on and be like having this ceremony, and seeing like where the world went from there. But just consuming it all from a different perspective. And that whole time, every time we went out, like we established the mask and the hand sanitizer, wash your face, hang up your mask. We established those routines there. But just when I went out there, Asia has this different level of respect for people in general. I mean, specifically for elders, right? The hierarchy is very different there, but just in general, like the what we call freedom in America, a lot of times I feel like is about I do what I want. And I very much disagree with that's what freedom is, right? Freedom is more about pursuing the things that you want, not just not following the rules or not obeying orders. But in Asia, like that's very strict, right? And the guidelines are followed. So anytime we went anywhere, I just felt comfortable because I knew everyone else in that space respected each other. And that's why I don't feel that way. Like when you go to the grocery store, you go out, it's really every person for themselves. Where in Asia, you could feel that there was an aspect of community here, right? And we're kind of all in this together. It was very interesting to get back and kind of see the reality of how different we're handling this whole thing compared to how they're handling it in Asia.
Yeah, I mean, I bet that was. I think. Well, one thing I will say is I'm glad you were able to have the wedding that you planned, because so many people, that's the story, right? That after March, people weren't able to have the wedding that they planned. And then there was this thing, I even saw a headline actually yesterday about why you should have a Zoom wedding. And so like Zoom weddings became a thing, right? But I'm really glad you got to have the wedding that you planned. And I remember sitting on Instagram and looking at your stories and thinking, oh my gosh, I was supposed to be there. But then at the very end, like your very last story of, coming back, that empty airport, I was like, wow, that was unreal. Like to see like I'd never seen an airport that was shutting down before. And so to see that you were like the only people in the airport trying to get out of the country, it looked like one of those like end of the world movies. It was
felt like that.
Really?
It felt like that. I mean, yeah, I'm so grateful. Amanda and we did a podcast called The Last Wedding in the World, just like document what the experience was like for us, because we knew something like that hopefully was never going to happen again. And we felt fine. 18 days that we were there, it was fine. And then it like once Taiwan and Singapore said they were shutting down their airports, it became scary, right? It was like, oh no, like now we're really risking getting stuck here. And yeah, we were on the last flight out of Taiwan. Our flight was at 11:45 p.m. So 23:45 p.m. And at 23:59, they were shutting down the international transfer terminal. So you had to be in the terminal by 23:59 to be able to catch any other flight out. And
it's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, we had a 3.5 hour warning to get on to that flight to get out of Bangkok. So that was wild. At that point, everyone had left because the emergency had already been declared. So this wasn't until the following Tuesday. Our wedding was on Thursday. And yeah, being in that airport was really scary. Walking through, when we got on the airplane from Bangkok to Taiwan, it was like so difficult for us to buy that flight 3 hours before. And when we got on the plane, there was nobody on the plane, right? Like there was probably a couple dozen people at all on the plane. And it was like, how was it so difficult for them to sell us a ticket when all of these seats are open? But obviously there was so many things going on about maybe why they couldn't have bought it. And yeah, thinking back to those times, it's one of those things like I have zero blame for anyone who didn't make it to Thailand, because it was a crazy, crazy thing to do, right? To fly, especially a lot of people were flying after they had deemed it a pandemic, and to deal with all that stress. And I'm so lucky that nobody contracted the virus when we were there. The wedding went off with pretty much no hitches at all. And it all worked out. I feel very blessed that happened. But looking back on it now, it's like, man, that like, it was so close to not being that way. Yeah. And being in that Taiwan airport with nobody in there was just, it was wild, because that's one of the biggest airports in the world as far as transfers go. And to just see it empty, right. And they have those hallways that like go for a mile and there's just nobody there. It was quite the thing to experience.
Yeah, I bet. Well, I'm glad you made it back safely.
Me too.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't, some of the stories that were coming out around that time about people who didn't make it back, just getting stuck. And, they were sending like these different countries then had to charter like emergency flights to go pick up their citizens. Yeah. I mean, it's hard to think about it now, but back then it felt like the world was coming to an end. Like it felt like everything was just falling apart. And it was like everything you've ever seen in any Hollywood apocalypse movie. And yeah, that was something to see. And so I'm glad that wasn't your experience, because there were lots of people who, I mean, just all over the world, you saw these stories. And it was interesting, I think, because on the flip side, right, at least in Washington State was shutting down. And so people who hadn't gone anywhere were being told, you cannot go anywhere. You need to stay home. And so then the whole stay home, stay safe thing started. And, businesses that were open one day now were closed the next day. And then the only thing that seemed to make any sense anymore was that you could go shopping at the grocery store. And so I was still at that point going to the grocery store, and I wasn't wearing a mask because there was no mask mandate at that point.
Yeah, at that point they were saying to not wear a mask. Right?
Yes, they were.
And whether that was to maintain the supply, right? So you weren't taking away from essential workers or from medical workers. Yeah, at that point, the CDC was actively saying like you shouldn't wear a mask.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it wasn't effective to wear the cloth mask. So they were saying that N95, they didn't want people to buy up those for the healthcare, because they didn't want to make sure the healthcare workers had them. But regular people who were not essential workers shouldn't wear any mask, because there was a point at which people were saying, okay, well, I could just wear these other types of masks, a bandana. I could wear one of the cloth masks. I can wear whatever masks that were not N95. And they were saying, no, those aren't effective. You don't need to wear them at all. So this is important, because this is actually, for me, that was always the problem that I had when literally a month later they said, oh, actually, you should wear a mask. These same masks that we told you were not effective, they are now effective. So now we're in April and we have a mask mandate, and we should all wear a mask everywhere we go. And these same masks that weren't effective last month are now effective. How did that happen? And I think that was the beginning of the mask war, because mask culture war, because and maybe you can't do that.
And maybe you say, like, our whole that was like the first time of the year where it was like the line was drawn with trust, right? Like, what do we believe? What's real? What's not real? What's the information? And that's going to play out for the next 9 months. I mean, obviously forever, about like the information we're receiving, whether through the government officials or through the news. Like, what are we supposed to believe and what can we believe? And as we know with the other topics we're going to talk about, like it's a theme that has been consistent.
Yeah, I mean I think that's a really good point, because in that month of March, I was glued to Governor Jay Inslee's coronavirus updates. I mean, I would stop whatever time they came on. If it was the lunchtime update or if it was the 5 p.m. update, I'd stop whatever I was doing. I would make, and if I had left the house, I would come back and make sure I was there to watch what he had to say. And if I got caught in the car, I'd make sure I had it on NPR because they would play it live. Like this, it was such an important thing to know what the governor had to say. I don't think I've ever cared as much about what any governor had to say, but I needed to know. And by the end of, I don't know, probably like April, I was like, I'm not listening to anything else this guy has to say, because what ended up happening over time was that the messages started to conflict, right? So it wasn't just the message that changed from March to April from the CDC or from the federal government, but also local messages started to change, and people started to question, like, why are we locked down this way? We see other states. So one thing that happened after the March lockdown, other states started locking down. So California was first, and then it was like a domino effect after that. We saw all of these other states shutting down, just, hours or days apart. But by the end of April, we saw reopening happening in Georgia, Florida, Texas, and so
oh my God,
you're wondering, like, well, wait a minute, why did they only have a 4-week lockdown, or even less? I mean, it may have even been 3 weeks for certain states. So why did they have such a short lockdown? But we're still in this phase one, because of course now they've rolled out phases for reopening by this point. So we have phases for reopening, and we're still in phase one. We're still locked down completely, but these other states are open completely. Bars, restaurants, everything's back open. How does that work? So I think that's when the government officials started to lose their grip on the cooperation of the public. Was now you see different states taking different paths, and the messages. So people don't know what am I supposed to do where I live versus what I'm hearing on national news about where someone else lives. And there was a point in time when New York became the focus, and we would hear from Governor Cuomo every single day. I mean, actually, that's still going on. He's still like on the news, but we don't live in New York, right? So why are we so focused on what's happening there? And so that's, for me, was when I shifted to local news. I started paying way more attention to independent local media at that point, because I needed sources that I could really understand and feel like I could trust. And I think that actually has continued, because as the year went on, other things were happening locally. And I could see very clearly there was a difference between the national media's version of the truth and the independent local media's version of the truth.
Let's transition into that, unless you got last things to say about kind of coronavirus and the early shutdowns. But I feel like that's a good transition to go into the summer season.
No, I think the only thing that I will say to sort of set up sort of the where the rest of the year goes, themes started to emerge during this time, right? So there was housing insecurity became a big deal. Food insecurity became a huge deal. And we're still talking about that even now, the fact that food bank lines have not receded. We still have very, very long food bank lines. And work from home became the norm for a large portion of workers, particularly in Seattle, a tech city where let's not even call it a tech city, a knowledge worker city, right? Yeah. So work from home became the norm. And so there became this new lifestyle that kind of sprung up around being a work from homer. And Then the city started talking about it was going to have a budget crisis. The state started talking about that too. We started hearing about that all over the country, really, that there were going to be budget problems due to the pandemic. And, April, May went along. And then at the end of May, we have a holiday, right? That was at the end of May. What holiday is that? Memorial Day?
Labor Day or Memorial Day?
Memorial Day. Memorial Day. There was a concern. So during spring break, we saw a lot of coronavirus cases. And then Memorial Day, there were a lot of folks who were enjoying Memorial Day like they always do. And that was also the same weekend as George Floyd's murder. So we saw the spike in coronavirus cases after that related to all of the activities people had. And then that kicked off the season of demonstrations. And that was another thing. That was one of those things where I just didn't see that coming. But now, having listened to a lot of particularly podcasts and reading a lot of articles, the circumstances sort of one could have predicted that was going to happen.
Yeah, it was perfect.
Yeah.
And so, oh man, just reflecting on that weekend that George Floyd was murdered. I remember I was in Portland for that weekend, and I drove down to Portland that Thursday. And on Friday here in Seattle, we had our first protest, and it wasn't like it was well attended, but it wasn't. It certainly wasn't national news. And I remember driving home on Saturday, and that was the first big protest. And that was the one where thousands of people met in downtown. This is the first time where there was major property damage. There were cop cars that were lit on fire. There were big, contingent, what's it called? Just not fighting. What was that?
Clashes, yeah,
between police and protesters, right? There was the really popular scene of the child who got maced or had I guess it was pepper spray at the time while at the protest. And I remember driving home, and Amanda was giving me live updates of what was happening. It was one cop car got lit on fire, 2 cop cars got lit on fire. And you could feel it from just consuming it on the internet. On Twitter, this is getting more serious. And then I remember we were just driving through the Tacoma area, and it was the protesters have now shut down the freeway. And it was this, with being in the car, not really knowing what was happening, just reading tweets. It was all right, we can't take the freeway. We got to take 99. So get off on the airport and go. And I remember getting home, just being really confused about everything that was going on, because I had been traveling. I hadn't really been reading the news the last couple of days. I wasn't aware all that much of what had happened in Minnesota, at least to the detail that we know now, right? I knew that at that point, I knew someone had been killed by a police officer and that there were major protests. And I remember the big thing remembering is the major Target got lit on fire in Minnesota. And then I remember just sitting on the news, and pretty much for the next month, that's when I became it went from you were talking about being glued to consuming information about coronavirus to being glued to information about the demonstrations and the protests that were going on. Mostly I was very consumed with what's going on locally, but also nationally. And it was a crazy time. And I know that's kind of when you and I started having conversations more about a lot of the topics. I mean, that was the beginning of our conversations about this show. And just what to do. And that's what led to the Black Square conversation. But I just remember that Saturday sitting on my couch and watching all the news broadcasts of that protest happening that day. And being concerned, right, about what was going to happen, right? Was the city going to turn into a riot? Was it going to turn into, more of a war versus a demonstration and protest? And yeah, that's really the only day that, if you want to say it was a riot, that's fine. That was the only day that could be deemed a riot in my eyes. The rest were just protests and demonstrations. But that day was particularly just crazy to watch and crazy to experience.
Yeah. Yeah, that was something. So okay, so that Friday, um, the protest was not planned that Friday. It was the protest for Saturday was planned. That
Yeah.
demonstration that got really out of control downtown, that was planned. In fact, if I recall correctly, there were supposed to be 3 planned for that day. Downtown was one of them, Capitol Hill was one, and I don't remember where the third one was supposed to be, or if it was just at a different time, but also downtown. But I remember the one on Friday came out of nowhere. They weren't expecting that one. And there was a little bit of property damage. So there's so the demonstration started, I think, in downtown, made its way up to Capitol Hill, and there was some damage at I think it's a Ferrari dealership that's in Capitol Hill.
Yep.
And there was some damage at Amazon Go. Amazon Go was a frequent target. Yeah. And I remember when that happened, thinking to myself, oh, that's interesting, those particular locations. But I didn't think much more beyond that about it. But I remember that was sort of, now I think looking back, it's sort of like, that's sort of like the, what's the foreshadowing of what was to come, because that became an ongoing thing. Not the Ferrari dealership, but the actual Amazon Go store continued to be targeted throughout the protests. And I think for me, the protests, they started to shift away from just being about George Floyd, just being about police brutality, to really, in my view, being about class issues, because so many of the demonstrators were not out there talking just about police brutality. They were talking about gentrification. They were talking about wealth inequality. They were talking about, these giant corporations that dominate the city. And when you saw the places that were, vandalized or had windows broken out, they tended to be Amazon, Starbucks, Whole Foods, the places that are owned and run by the dominant corporations in the city. So I think there was a story that the media did not pick up on there, that there's an undercurrent of inequality happening that was happening before the pandemic, certainly exacerbated by, pandemic shutdown. And now you have people who are stuck at home and coming out to demonstrate, not only because, they feel passionate about an issue, but also because that was the thing to do. And let me tell you, there were people, you probably saw it on Instagram, there were people who were hanging out at the demonstrations. They weren't there because they wanted to do anything other than see people, because at that point we were under full lockdown. And, where can you go? There's no nightclub, there's no bar, there's no restaurant open. So you go to the protest. And there were people who I watched on Instagram. They'd go to the Tacoma protest, they'd go to the Renton protest, and then they'd by 9 p.m. they were in Capitol Hill, and it was like I don't know. I think the mayor of Seattle called it the summer of love, because people were partying in the street, they were playing music, and I'm like, what is this? This looks like Coachella in the middle of Seattle, and I think that was the other thing that was happening, that I realized that these pandemic circumstances, they led to a lot of people coming out into the street, but not for the same reasons. And I think that, as we move further into the year, there was polling that came out later on that talked about how sort of there was a drop off in the level of posting about Black Lives Matter and sort of the engagement around the issues, which I'm not surprised about. But, at the end of the day, when you see those kinds of numbers, you see that many people come into the streets, the story that was being told was, these people are here because they are upset, they want to see change. And being in the neighborhood, seeing local independent media versus the national media, and seeing Instagram in particular, like looking at just all of the people I follow, and then looking at the hashtags and looking at the location tags, I could see there are two different worlds I shouldn't say worlds, two different stories being told here. And the one that I think is more true, since we're talking about truth here, I think it's more complicated. I don't think it's just about police brutality.
Yeah, I mean, there was and maybe that was due to I don't want to say lack of organization. It all came together, but there wasn't like centralized leadership, and so a lot of different parties had their own messages, right? And it went from one side being like abolish the police. There's the defund the police. There were just Black Lives Matter, right? And then the normal inequality situation all kind of mixed in there. And so it all did kind of all come up to a point with the abandonment of the East Precinct there in Capitol Hill. And that was incredible to watch. That was the first thing that I've experienced in my lifetime where I wasn't watching the news. I was only watching it through live streams, right? Because that protest right there at the East Precinct on Twitch, and you can also watch it on Facebook, and this is the beginning of Converge Media and some other groups, but there was a couple on the window above the precinct filming down on the front line. There was another person who was across the building only filming the front line. And then there was like 10 people who were actually in the crowd also live streaming it. So you could like get on these channels and just like feel like you were there. Right. It felt like I was there, and I would sit there every night for hours, and just there wasn't a lot going on. Right. For a majority of the time, there was nothing going on. There was just chanting and protesting. And then like a bottle would be thrown, a rock would be thrown, and then the police would engage. Right. And that kind of like would break it up and then come back again. But that was a wild thing to watch. But going back to the original point, there just wasn't like a centralized message, right? There was very much different messages going on, and it was confusing about like who's actually coming to the negotiation table with the chief of police and the mayor. It was very, very hard to follow. And I feel like you talked about the local news versus the national news. It was kind of like a big turning point in like, oh, what sources are you looking at? Like, how are you consuming the information? How are you learning about what's going on? Because it was hard to like just in our one city to understand what was happening between the news corporations, the independent media, the people who were live streaming there, what the mayor was saying, right? The mayor said it was the summer of love. It's like, what? Like, I get that the CHAZ kind of was more like Coachella than with obviously activism going on at the same time. But yeah, just very mixed messages. And it was weird to kind of make adjustments about how I was consuming the information and trying to learn about like what I think the truth is by starting to watch these like streamers versus, going to King 5 or Como or whoever it was.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up, because technology here in this space it doesn't get a lot of credit, but, I was doing the same thing, right? I was constantly watching these live streams on YouTube, and not just of what was happening in Seattle, but also what was happening in other cities, because at the same time, we've got LA, Minneapolis, Louisville, like they're just everywhere. Like all of this is happening everywhere at the same time. And I would, like you, I was just for hours, I would just sit there and just watch. Like after I'd finish work for the day, that's all I would do until I went to sleep. I'd wake up in the morning, I'd start watching like what happened the night before that I missed after I was sleeping. And I was sleeping, I don't know, maybe 4 hours a night, because it was just captivating. And that went on for me for about a week. And then finally I had to stop because it was just too much. And they took a day. And I said, I need a moment to just like not watch anything and get my mind together, because it's one of those things where I think for me, I realized I was like, this should not be entertainment. Yeah. This should not be how I'm spending my time. Instead of watching a movie or a TV show, I'm watching demonstrations. I'm watching police clashing with protesters. I'm watching buildings getting lit on fire. Like there's a certain level of information I need from that, but there's a certain point where it no longer becomes productive. It just becomes
protest porn.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think that's what I need to take from this. And so I remember thinking to myself, what do I need to do? What do I need to do? Because I knew one, I didn't, at that time, we still didn't know a lot about the coronavirus. And so while I felt very passionate about the issues, I did not feel comfortable going out to a demonstration. I felt like that would not be a good place for me to be. Mask mandate was new at that point, and people still, we would see lots of images of people not wearing masks. We know now that, being outside actually is a better place to be, and there's less risk of transmission when you're in an outdoor space and wearing a mask. But back then, I remember I would take a walk somewhere and I would step across the other side of the street if I had to pass somebody, because I didn't know. We didn't know, and people would do the same too. Like that was just the norm. Like you didn't want to be close to anyone. You were told you had to stay 6 feet, and sidewalks don't give you 6 feet. So I remember walking in the street a lot, and so as I mentioned at the very beginning of the pandemic, I was taking a lot of walks. But when the demonstrations started to happen in the same neighborhood I stay in, I stopped walking. And I never really started back up after that because I just didn't feel as comfortable going outside. There was just too much happening in the neighborhood, and I couldn't figure out where the next demonstration was going to pop up. And sometimes it was on my street. Sometimes it was a block or two away. Sometimes it was several blocks away. It was a really crazy time. And I just remember thinking to myself, what do I want to do in this moment? Who do I want to be? How do I want to think about this? Because all of this stuff is happening in the world, happening in this neighborhood. And I kept thinking a lot about the fact that people are demonstrating because they want change and they want to be heard. And they're trying to get attention for issues that are being ignored by people who get to make decisions about whether those problems get solved or not. And around this same time at my job, this sudden conversation sprung up due to George Floyd's murder around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that had never been something that we talked about before. And I think that day that I took time away from watching all the live streams to just think about, what did I want to do now? Because I have a certain level of access to leaders in the organization I work for. So I have something that many people are out in the street trying to get, which is the attention of people who are leaders. And I said, well, I can actually, they know me by name. I can email them if I want to. And while I occupy a very small slice of life, right? Healthcare is the industry I'm in. I realized that was something I wanted to make sure I took advantage of, that I'm in this space where I can speak to gatekeepers. And that was also the time when you and I started talking, as you mentioned before, about this podcast, because I felt like what I didn't want to happen was that this moment just passes. Like, this is not the first set of demonstrations we've seen related to police brutality. There was Ferguson just 6 years before, and that was a big set of global demonstrations. There was Trayvon Martin before that, right? And that was a big set of global demonstrations. And every single time we had these big global demonstrations, nothing changed. And I think part of it has to do with the fact that it's very difficult to be an activist. It's very difficult to be an ally, an advocate, and to sustain that work because it's very draining. You're constantly fighting a machine that is so big and hard to understand. It's designed for you not to be able to make the changes that you think need to be made. So when we started talking about this, there was still, CHOP and CHAZ, the Capitol Hill organized protest, the Capitol Hill autonomous zone, the two names that the park had at that point in time, that was still a thing. That was still around. I remember us talking about, helicopters and the things that were the police sirens, because that was a constant presence in the neighborhood centered around this one park, which if you had ever been there before that, right, it was a totally different world. Like it was not like it was portrayed in the media. So I just remember thinking to myself at that point, it would be good to not be just a bystander in this moment or just an observer in this moment, but actually to step forward and be someone who is actively trying to make change inside of an ecosystem and outside, and trying to support the people who are in the streets and the people who are in the offices, or people who are working from home, because everybody's action looks different, right? And we need everybody to come in their own way. We need everybody in the room to try to change things. And so I realized for me, that's what my action needed to look like. It was leaning into DE&I and race conversations at work, even though that wasn't something I had been doing before, because there just wasn't time and space dedicated to that. It was leaning into that in a public way, right? Like doing this podcast and shifting my, app development project from one that was around barbershops as a use case to voting as a use case. Because also in the middle of all of this happening, there were primaries. There were primaries happening all over the country. And we were able to see the effects of both racism and the pandemic at play in real time, thanks to all of the technology that we have.
Yeah, I mean, that was such for how crazy it was. I look fondly back at that time because our conversations with each other shifted a lot too. Like I remember meeting you in that park out kind of in Capitol Hill and being like worried about going to that park in that area. Be like, let's meet when it's still light outside before, I want to be gone before it gets dark. We don't know if a protest is going to just like happen. I remember you texted me one day and you're like, there's a protest like outside my house right now. Right. And it was like, it just came from nowhere. Like, how do I know like where this is going to happen? And so we met up, and that was like the first time our conversation really shifted. You and I always used to just like really talk about business, right? And like concepts and ideas and systems and mechanisms. Very similar. It's kind of like how we've built the structure of this show. But then it started to really shift more about like race and equity and inclusion. And we started having more of those like really in-depth conversations with each other. And I think we took a lot of the business perspective that we used to have and kind of implemented it in a interesting conversation, which has led to this show and everything that we're doing here every other week. And you brought up the election. So unless you got one last thought kind of about the summer, it's probably a good time to transition to the fall going into the end of the year, because I know we've been here for well over an hour now.
Oh, wow. Well, let's see. So coming out of the summer, so now we're April, May, June, now moving into the third quarter, July, August, September. So we've, demonstrations never really stopped. They continued. And, the big phrase that came out of that was defund the police, right? We heard that a lot. And so we also saw the rise of, or I wouldn't say the rise. We started to see a lot of focus on Seattle now in a different way. So first it was about the pandemic, but then it became, as the election got closer, it became about how Seattle represented the kind of America that Trump in particular and Republicans didn't want to see. So they started to use CHOP and CHAZ and the events of the summer as a tool, right? Like as a campaigning tool to say, look, you see, this is what happens when you let Democrats run a city. And Seattle was labeled an anarchist city, along with a couple of other cities. But and then the election, tactics, the voter suppression tactics that were very, very present in other places and may have looked a little bit different, they suddenly started showing up in Portland and Seattle and with the mailboxes, right? And the breaking down of mail sorting machines inside of the post office that would have counted ballots, and it became all election all the time. And the thing that was so, I think for me, so interesting about this point was that was the point at which I left Seattle and came back to Texas. And as I drove across the country, I could see like the sort of like Seattle was this bubble that you wore a mask, but as soon as you got out of that place, like masks were not a thing. And it was interesting to see how different the world looked outside of the bubble that I had been in for 6 months.
Yeah, the thing that caught my attention with what you were saying was the shift from the election now took like a lot of our attention with the news. And it's interesting how each season, the way we've consumed the information is like addiction. If it's even how we talk about it seems like it was addiction, right? Like started with the pandemic and it was like addicting to watch all the announcements and the governor talking, or if it was Fauci or then Trump, whoever it was. And then the protest over summer was like, gotta watch that every day and be on top of it. And then, yeah, the election was like a mountain of more information going on, right? And with the election fraud claims and the voter suppression claims, and I know earlier it was like the primaries, who was going to actually win. Bernie was leading, and then all of a sudden Joe Biden, like the pandemic hit, and Joe Biden like won out of nowhere after like being irrelevant. Like there was a time in the primaries where Joe Biden was out, right? He like lost some states early on, and he was done. And then all of a sudden, like, it was like, oh, pandemic, let's put Joe in there. And yeah, just shifting into that like fall where my addiction of consumption was all about this election. And we've talked a bunch about the election, so maybe we don't need to dive too deep into what was going on there. But just paying attention to like what was happening to those mail drop boxes, right? And the concern with what was happening there, then having record turnout of the actual election. I mean, election week was can compete with one of the wildest weeks of the year, which it has a lot to compete with when you think about the other seasons that we've talked about. And that's still ongoing, right? We like it seems like Donald Trump hasn't really done anything since that election week except play golf, but that's still ongoing. Like it sounds like he's planning a demonstration on January 20th and January 4th. So we'll see what happens with his attempt at a coup, as I know we've talked about. But then that was the other concern of the fall, right? I remember you brought that to my attention, like, hey, like we need to be prepared for this because no matter what happens in the upcoming election, like if Trump loses, he's going to do everything he can to not disenfranchise is the thing, but like invalidate the entire election. And I mean, you saw that coming way ahead of time.
Yeah, you know, it's so interesting, you know, now looking back on it, because while certainly it hasn't gotten as extreme as I think some folks thought it could, it is getting, I mean, things are starting to heat up. Like as the closer we get to Inauguration Day, we're starting to see a lot of activity that looks, you know, like all of these pardons, right? Like, so pardons, the pardons were expected, but then, you know, there's more and more coming out, and there are things like, particularly right now today, right? Stimulus bill, right? So we have a second pandemic stimulus bill waiting for the president to sign, and he refuses to sign it. There's also a looming government shutdown on Monday. So all of these look like, to me, tantrums, right? You lost and now you're not happy. So you want to make everyone, you're upset. You want to make all of us upset. So if I don't eat, nobody eats. That's what it sounds like to me. And I don't like that, obviously. And I don't think anybody does, which is, you know, I think if there's a big lesson that I don't know if people will take this away or not, but that leadership matters. Who gets to make decisions matters. Like you should not play around with leadership. We should take leader, and not just the presidency, but anyone who's in a leadership position, we should take it seriously. Just because you like someone, or just because someone is famous or rich or on TV all the time, does not mean that they can make decisions in a crisis. I think we have to really start to evaluate what is our criteria for who gets to be a leader. What are the qualities that we need them to be able to have? Because if you look at this entire year, all I see on all levels, I see poor communication. And I'm speaking independently of Trump here. Poor communication, poor decision making, poor planning. Like, pandemics aren't new. We had the same type of pandemic 100 years ago. So it's not like we don't know what we are supposed to do. What we have chosen to do is to not invest in preparedness. Okay, well, who gets to choose whether or not we invest in preparedness? The people that we elect, right? That's what they're there for. So if they're not doing their job, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, then we have to hold them accountable. We also have to set some standards and expectations for this is what we expect when we put you in this place. You shouldn't feel as if you are entitled to be there, despite the fact that the voters have now said, you know what, you didn't do what we expected you to do. It's time for you to go and for us to have someone else be our representative. So these are the kinds of things that I think, I'm taking away as we have now made it to December and we're in the fourth quarter and all of this year has built up to where we are right now. The one, just going back a little bit though to third quarter, when we talk about trust and we talk about media, there was a war on the post office this year that right. Because of mail-in voting, so many states were using mail-in voting for the very first time. They had never done it before. And it was due to the pandemic. And that was a big part of, and continues to be a big part of the argument about voter fraud. Well, there are all of these dead people voting by mail. And that continues to this day. And I think it's really because the conversation just kept going on and on and on and on. I think for the post office, which already had a bad reputation, I think there's a lot of new distrust, right? And I don't know how we necessarily get that back. I think we still have to rely on the post office, but when it comes to vote by mail, we saw in Houston, once I was down here, we saw record turnout around the mail-in ballot drop boxes because people were afraid to put their ballot in the mailbox, even though they received their prescription via mail. They received credit cards and debit cards via mail. Their voter registration card came in the mail. So it's not like the mail doesn't work, but in the media, that was the story because that is what the Republicans said was a problem. And then, as we've talked about here on the show, that was then used to reduce the number of mail-in ballot drop box locations in the state of Texas. So it just became this thing that I think just got. I don't even know how to describe what happened. I mean, I think it was the media amplified a message that was very damaging to a system that was actually working fine for people. And I'm curious to see what happens in future elections, right? Because we have a segment of the population, they've been exposed to a way of voting that I think they're going to like. Does it get to continue? I think in some places it will not continue. I think Washington State had it before, will continue to have it. But I think other places that had it this time around, I think will not have it in the future because of what happened this year.
Yeah, and that comes back to your point about leadership, right? I mean, and the leadership that gets elected right now is going to be very important. We still have another election coming up in Georgia the first week of January that is going to have big implications. And when it comes to leadership, I mean, we lost people this year, or let's say they both stepped down, but everything leading up led to the resignation from Chief Carmen Best she was the head of Seattle Police Department here. And then also we had our mayor, Jenny Durkan, not resign, but say she's not going to run next year for the next election. So she served her one term and she is stepping down. And so now we have this kind of, I'm sure we're going to dive way more into it here in the show because I assume the election's probably not until later next year anyways. But you made a great point about it's created this new spotlight on leadership, and hopefully a lot of people have realized the importance of who you choose to put in those positions, and it's beyond just politics, right? It's who are in leadership positions as low down in your family hierarchy or your social friend circle, right? Like, who are the voices that you're listening to and you're taking cues and leads from? Who are the leaders in management at your employer? Extremely important, from top all the way to bottom. If you report to someone, that's a power dynamic and an influence dynamic that is very important. And so we're all at least having a different aspect of learning and recognizing the differences in leadership and the importance of who we put in those places, because every single month this year, more than ever, we have these big defining moments that happen, and we see a lack of leadership, to put it straightforward. And one of the things that I'm honestly grateful for this year is that I haven't been in a major leadership position. I know you and I talked a little bit offline about that, and I empathize for people who are in those positions in this year, because, oh man, I'm very grateful that I didn't have employees this year. I think that would have been really, really difficult. I empathize for anyone who has, if you're a manager and you've got employees that are reporting to you, dealing with the anxiety and the stress of the job and everything that happened this year, and dealing with that from a manager level all the way to a leader owner level has got to be extremely difficult. It's a very challenging job. I'm not surprised that Jenny Durkan is not going to run again. It seems like a job that is going to be extremely difficult. I think Joe Biden also has a nearly impossible task ahead of him. These are jobs that you just can't make decisions to represent everybody. It's so hard. And nowadays, everyone also has a voice, which is good and bad, right? You want everyone to have a voice, but also it sometimes drowns out the important voices because it's just a flood of things coming in. And so to have that job, to take over that leadership is going to be very difficult. I hope we give that person a chance. I hope they're given an honest chance. But even like being a council member, like that's got to be so hard. There were protesters who showed up at these people's houses and shown spotlights into their bedrooms, right? And they've got children and significant others who are kind of outside of that scope. Obviously, they signed up for that, but that's got to be so hard. Like, I couldn't imagine if I had 100 people last night show up at my house and chanting shining lights into my house for me to make a decision. That's got to be so difficult. It is what they signed up for. It's also the reason why I don't think I'm strong enough to take one of those positions or run for one of those positions. I think I can have more impact doing something else. But those changes in leadership, I mean, over this next year, there's going to be a continued push about like who's taking those. And I think we are going to get better, hopefully get better as a society and as individuals about what are the criteria, what are the things we're looking for, and how does this person meet those standards, so we can get some people in there. These are the times where iconic leaders are made, right? There will be people who come out of this who get the statue conversation, right? And get memorialized in a way for their bravery, heroism, leadership, and it'll be interesting to see who those people are in the future.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, if we can look ahead to 2021, I think that is it exactly, right? Like, the conversation about leadership continues. So in Seattle, it's the mayoral race, right? Seattle will have a new mayor, and there are lots of people whose names are out in the atmosphere. And I think that's good. But that would have happened anyway, right? Like, there's always going to be an election. I think what we will see is that people are voting on values and issues. And I think that's tricky to navigate. To your point, there's always going to be someone who's for and against. And I think, there was a recent article on postalley.org, First Take, handicapping contenders for Seattle's next mayor. And it was a really interesting article because essentially it really laid out the different sort of lanes that different potential candidates would be in. And it argued for a coalition approach. So different lanes would need to come together to get a single candidate elected, and not necessarily by a large majority. So to your point, you could end up very well in a situation where someone is elected, very, very popular with a very limited segment of the population, and that person could be supporting issues that a majority of people who are not in favor of, or they might be supporting some issues that a majority of people are in favor of, but others that a majority of people are not in favor of. And I think it's because of how the coalition will end up coming together, right? So you might have, it was interesting, some of the ways that they describe the coalitions, right? They call it the urbanist bike lane crowd, which I mean, I definitely believe that's a thing in Seattle. But then you have the Black Lives Matter, and then you have the corporate interest, and so you might have corporate interests and urbanists get together because oftentimes those people are also working in corporations and they work from home. So I think work from home is a lane. They didn't define it that way, but I think that's a lane. Like I think the work from home crowd, they work for major corporations generally.
Yeah, it's an economic lane. Sorry.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And I think that's something to keep in mind. And then there's essential worker crowd, right? Like essential workers are often not represented within the work from home crowd. So who's representing their interests? And what I have observed this year is that the city council has tried in ways that don't often meet the expectations or desires of the work from home crowd and the corporations, right? So I remember there was hazard pay that was mandatory for gig workers, and I was fully in support of it, but it did drive up the price, right, of anything that you had delivered via Uber Eats or a Lyft ride, because those companies that provide those services actually have a model that is rather exploitative if you look at it, right? Like those workers are not employees, and that's a legal status that also guarantees you health insurance. But when you're an independent contractor, that you don't get those same benefits. And in the middle of a pandemic, suddenly the job that you do puts you at greater risk with no health insurance. So those workers said, I need a little bit more. Those companies said no. The city council said, yes, you get more. And so who has to pay for that? The work from homer. And so there's this whole sort of economic cycle happening in the middle of all of this that I think is going to present itself again next year in more defined ways as there's an opportunity to fight for the future of the city. I think what we saw this year was that people left the city, right? A lot of the work from homers said, I can move further north or further south or further further east. And I think that's going to have an impact on who gets to be a leader. I think the economic inequality and the just cost of living that hasn't really changed. It's actually, in some ways, it's gotten worse, right? So I think those issues are going to matter, but they're going to matter to different people in different ways. And the solutions that people are going to look for, that they're going to look for leaders to articulate, are going to look different depending on what side of the, I would say, work spectrum or work coin, maybe I'll say work coin, that you're on. Are you work from home? Are you essential? And what was your 2020 like? What happened to you in 2020? Did you lose your job? Did you get a promotion and a raise? Did you buy a new house? Because there are some people who have had a spectacular year. They've made more money than they've ever made. They've gotten to buy a house. They've gotten to live a life that suddenly, is accessible to them. And then there are other people, their lives fell completely apart, the opposite direction. Did you have to fight with the state for unemployment? These are real life issues. And I think voters are going to be going and looking for the leader who can speak to them. And I think that's just going to bring out all kinds of candidates. And that's a good thing in one way, but it's going to require coalitions that may have in some ways competing interests, may in other ways have the same interests, but it won't be everybody's interest.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to these elections, unfortunately, it's never everybody's interest. And the pandemic has shown, though, like you said, there's such a distinction between different people's lives, right? There's people that are having a lot of success right now, and there's people that are having the, biggest catastrophe of their whole life. There's tens of millions of people that are unemployed right now. It's very interesting. And the election will reflect that for sure. And I think you're right about the coalitions. Our groups are going to have to kind of come together so they can appeal to a broader group of people with all saying, hey, but your interests are also looked after. I think also in the national election, it was very similar. It's just like people's, and we talked a lot about the election and what people's priorities are, right? It comes down to what your experience was this year, and that's how you reflect on the world, and that's what you find is important moving forward, and how you think the election is going to benefit you in your own way. And I think that's going to get dissected in a very interesting way coming up in 2021 here locally, in how we see people's priorities and the situation that they're in, and how that affects the people that they want in leadership moving forward.
Absolutely.
Oh,
Yes. Oh no, I was going to say, the issue that I think is going to be a dividing line is actually defund the police. I think that is going to be a dividing line. I think there's going to be a group of politicians that are in support of defunding the police. I think there's going to be another group that isn't. And I think that's where the coalitions are going to build around in that way. So it's going to be defund the police and something else and something else. Not defund the police, or police reform maybe is what they talk about on the other side, in some other lane and some other lane. Like, I think that's going to be how we start to see these races take shape. And it's strange and it's unfortunate, because really what you're talking about when you're talking about defund the police is you're talking about the city budget, which is exactly the conversation you want to have, right? Is about what is going on with the city budget. And I think so few people until this year, until the phrase defund the police, had no idea even what was in the city budget and how it works. And I think, if these leaders can, I don't know how much time and space there is to ever talk about city budgets. I mean, who wants to get that deep into it? I'm sure it's not that as exciting of a topic. It's much more exciting to say what you're going to do for people. But the reality is most people have no idea how these budgets are formed and what's in them and what you can and cannot cut, or what will be easy to cut.
What are the responsibilities of those budgets and the unions behind them? Yeah, totally.
Mm-hmm. So the Vice News piece that I sent to you, I really thought was really very helpful, because Lorena Gonzalez, who is the chief or president maybe of the Seattle City Council, she really gave a good breakdown of what the process was for them that they had to go through and for 2020 to figure out where they could make cuts in the police budget, and then what the work ahead for 2021 would look like and what the challenges would be, because the Seattle City Council actually made a commitment to a 50% cut, and then couldn't achieve that in 2020. And she really explained in a very clear and easy to understand way why that didn't take place. But I think it's important for people to know that, because when they start to see leaders and talk about this issue, I don't think they'll be able to get a really full picture of what does that process look like, and what should one expect based on the obstacles that are in place. And this Vice News piece is called "How Defunding the Police is Working Out in Seattle." So it's really starting from summertime to now. But I think as we look ahead to who gets to lead the city, I think we will actually hear more about that. We heard a lot about it, in fact, after the presidential election, because some national Democrat politicians, so like congressional and Senate candidates, they actually said that was the reason why they didn't win, that their constituents looked at them as being in favor of defunding the police, because they were really good Republican sort of advertising around that in these these really hotly contested races. And so whether it was true or not, it didn't matter that voters started to associate anyone who was a Democrat with defunding the police. So that's what they say. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what they say. And if that is true, I think we're going to see it really play out in Seattle in a really major way. And I don't know what to think about that, because I feel like the city budget is what should be on the table, not the term defund the police. Like what the city does with its funds when it taxes citizens and who it chooses to tax, right? How it chooses to tax and what it chooses to spend its money on. I think that matters, and that should matter to people. But I think so much of the detail of that gets lost with, are you for defunding or not for defunding?
I think you're spot on with that, Mr. Well-Traveled. Like, it's all about, we need to defund the police. But you and I talk about language so much and how we're phrasing that. And it's like, we need to talk more about where all the budget money is going, right? Like, and a lot of people can get behind the money that is, if it's taken out of the police department, where it's put into, right? And kind of like focusing more about like, here's where all the money, this is how you're getting taxed, which you mentioned, right? Here's all the money coming in, and here's how we're divvying it up, right? And how are we prioritizing these different things? What are the contracts, right? What are the corporate commitments, the union commitments that we have with all these? I think that is spot on with what you're saying about how we need to think about it and kind of take a broader aspect than focusing on this one simple term. Because when you talk about it, you're like, there's the reform the police and the defund the police. And it's like, everyone agrees there that something needs to change, right? That the system doesn't work, hasn't been working. It's a power and corruption problem that we have. And how do we come to a solution? It sounds like everyone's kind of on the same page for the most part about there needs to be a solution, but we kind of need to define it a little better. And we've let catchphrases take over the conversation and kind of distract a little bit. And you and I have talked about before how one party is very good at taking phrases and turning those into headlines and making them kind of cornerstone topics, which get us stuck in a hole talking about this thing. And a lot of times it's the distraction from what's going on somewhere else, which is not helping us. That's for sure.
Not helping us.
And so we're going to dive in a lot more to a lot of those topics. I'm sure the mayoral race is going to be a big topic, and just the elections coming up in general. The last thing, we also have a rollout of a vaccine for coronavirus, which is like absolutely crazy. 9 months after we declared a pandemic, we now have, I believe, 2 approved vaccines.
That's right.
Just here in America. I'm not even really up to date about what's going on in the rest of the world, right? Because I assume all these, I know Russia has their own vaccine. I assume China's got at least one. Kind of all the major countries, I'd assume, are working on something. And that all is happening right now. That's kind of like the new flood of information that people are addicted to. And there's been plenty of controversy around who's getting it, when they're getting it. I saw a doctor who tested positive. He got the vaccine and then he tested positive like a week later. And so that's becoming a thing. We've got allergic reactions. So there's a lot of skepticism. Understandable, in my opinion, to be skeptical. 9 months is really quickly for us to develop this vaccine. We kind of heard both like December, but also people are like, it's going to take 2 years to get the evidence. There's a long way to go. I'm sure in 2021, we're going to document how that progresses, because eventually we assume next summer, there's going to be a broader array of people who qualify. I know I'm at the bottom of the list for qualifying to get one of these vaccines. So I know I'm not going to get that email anytime soon, but eventually we will, assuming that everything goes smoothly and dealing with that situation. I'm sure you and I are going to have a deeper conversation about making that decision and how it's affecting as it gets out to the broader public. Because now it's very specific to individuals. The one thing, and maybe we can talk about it in another episode, is just watching important politicians getting vaccines. It's been very interesting to watch videos. It seems very it's been very intentional, and just reminds me of a movie about like we need to make sure these politicians are on camera getting the vaccine, to build trust and proof and everything. And that's a very interesting dichotomy that is happening, that we're watching, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, and have more discussions. I don't know if you have any thoughts you want to share right now about the vaccine rollout.
No, not really. I guess my question actually, do you think it's effective, watching the politicians get it? Because I kind of wonder how effective that is for people as I see it.
Well, if I put on my tinfoil hat, right, which especially when it comes to the Republican politicians who are getting the vaccine, right, when you see Mike Pence getting the vaccine, if you're a skeptic already and you've been denying coronavirus and everything that's been going on, the giant conspiracy that people think it was like, why would you believe that, right? Mm-hmm. It's not hard to fake an injection, right? Like we've seen that in movies done forever. Right. Or he could be getting a flu shot. Like, is he like the skepticism is not hard to be like, yeah, I don't think he actually got the vaccine. And so the skeptics, I don't think it's actually like convinced. I can't imagine that someone was sitting at home and they're like, oh, Mike Pence got the vaccine. I trust him. I don't believe in any of the stuff, any of the denial that's happened for 9 months. And now we can believe that. Like, I just don't really believe that. I also, and this has been widely commented on, like it seems really weird that we have had a group of politicians who have denied the severity of the pandemic from the very beginning, and put millions and millions of people at risk, and in my opinion are responsible for the death of thousands of people because of their inaction or the way they've communicated the problem, and lack of urgency. To be some of the first people to be getting the vaccine just seems very backwards to me, that it's like these people have denied the pandemic for so long. Like, why do they need the vaccine? Right. It just kind of seems like it doesn't make sense. And that's what feels more like a PR stunt than anything like we've really seen this year is getting those people on camera. Yeah, that's what makes me uncomfortable about the situation. And I know I said this off camera. I think it's important that we follow along with these doctors and nurses and these people who are on the front lines who battle these people every day. Like I can't imagine what it would be like to be a nurse this year. My now sister-in-law, I performed the ceremony to marry my brother to his now wife, and she's a frontline worker and she got the vaccine. And it's like, know what? Like, she is getting the vaccine, right? Because she needs it so she can go to work every day. So it's like, those are the people that I want to follow, and I'm hoping for the best. I'm a pretty optimistic person. So we kind of need the vaccine to be effective, right? And we need it to work with all these doctors so they can continue doing the important work that they're doing. So I'm optimistic that we're doing the right thing, but I think it's totally fine to be skeptical about big pharma and big corporations getting this vaccine out so quickly, under immense political pressure from our leaders, right, who have been saying it every single day for months that this needs to come out now, and that we need to do something, and it needs to be out before the election was over or before the new president comes in. That is understandable to have concern about that, be skeptical about were the right policies taking place, what corners were cut. And, I guess I'm in an advantaged position that I do get the time to see how this is going to play out before I'm even in a position to make that decision right now. It's kind of just wait and see for me.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I do think it's going to be interesting. I feel the same. I'm waiting. I'm seeing. I want to know side effects. I want to see how the distribution plays out. I was thinking a little bit though as well about what is this going to look like over the coming months. We do have 2 vaccines approved, but we don't have enough vaccines for the demand, right? So the term that I had forgotten about that has popped back up in the news is herd immunity. So I think we're going to hear about herd immunity in 2021 until like almost like a countdown until we get to herd immunity. And that's, that according to Dr. Fauci, that looks like 75 to 80% of the US population has the vaccine. Well, that's a lot of people. So today, we don't have that much vaccine available, and you have to take it. You have to get two shots, right? So there's another sort of wrinkle there that this type of vaccine requires the individual to show up for the first shot, but also show up for a second shot. And they give everyone a card and let them know once they've had the vaccine when they need to come back for the second shot. I'd like to know what is the rate for people who do not show up for the second shot, because we don't know what is supposed to happen if they don't show up again. I think it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out over larger and larger numbers of people. So I think we're going to hear about herd immunity. That's going to be a thing going into 2021 and probably until we reach that point. I will say, though, having a vaccine out this quickly, we've never seen that, right? That leaves a lot of room for skepticism. And at the same time, I think there's still strong demand for it, because we have also been told that this is the solution, that it's pandemic or vaccine. So all we need to do is just get a vaccine out there. All this goes away, goes back to normal. What happens when there's not enough supply to meet demand? What do people do? How do states start to distribute? Because they have these loose guidelines from the CDC, but they can choose not to follow them. And Texas is the first state that has broken from the CDC's guidelines. So will we see more states do that? And how do they define who gets to be in which group? They're very loose. So I don't know. I think a lot about this being very political too. Yeah. I think we haven't seen it. I think we haven't seen it really get too political because of the holidays. I don't think people are that focused right now. And the group one is so small.
It's very small.
It's very well defined. So we know that if you are working in a hospital, which is a very small portion of the population, you get the vaccine. But also not all people in hospitals who work in hospitals get the vaccine. And there have been some issues of, class within that. I saw there were students at Stanford protesting because doctors who were working from home, who had a higher rank, got the vaccine before the residents who were actually seeing COVID patients on a daily basis for hours a day. Like, this is already taking place, even within this first group. So yeah, I'm curious what happens when we get to the broader population.
Yeah, when it gets to the general public, like there's not a lot of trust that our leadership can distribute it in a quality way. Yeah, because the hospital people, like, that's really well defined, like you said, right? We can get it there. They have their own internal dynamics, but when you start thinking about everybody else, it's going to be a long battle. And I think the inequality of society, which has been highlighted plenty this year, is going to kind of be lit on fire, because this is going to expose a lot of those systems that distribute unfairly. And I think I read with the Stanford situation that it might have been an algorithm that chose who got it, and so it prioritized seniority, and it was like this wasn't a situation for algorithm. This was a situation for, like, who's there, who needs it, let's get it to them. And so it'll be interesting how we decide how the general public gets it, right? Because we've got 1 million vaccinated, at least for the first step as of now. That's such a small drop in the water when you think about 200 million people are going to need this. It's going to be very interesting, and I am hoping that it goes smoothly, but that's going to depend on what state you live in, right? What state you live in right now is also a big topic that, I mean, we could probably do a whole show on, right? We see a lot of people moving out of Texas. I mean, a lot of people moving out of all the big cities for lots of different reasons. But moving to Texas, moving to Florida, moving to Washington are interesting things depending on how you want your life to go. But especially with like when it comes to income tax, those 3 states don't have it. And so that is just a big thing in general. You save 10% of your money to move to those places. So
yeah, I was reading an article about that yesterday. I mean, this is, yeah, there's so much that will start. The reshaping of whatever the next decade looks like is starting this year. I don't even think we have really come to understand it yet. I mean, we certainly will by the time we're 10 years in, but yeah, the people leaving particularly these high tax cities and states and coming to the South, Texas, Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, people are doing that in droves, and whole companies now relocating their headquarters. Hewlett Packard, Houston, Oracle going to Austin, Elon Musk becoming a resident of Texas. Like, this is going to change things, not just for the places that these companies and these very, very, very well individuals have left behind, but also now coming to these new places, because we're going to see that same cycle of, class play out in these new places. These new tech workers who were not here before, they're going to want a world that looks like the old world that they left. And we know that means if you were there before, you got to go. You get pushed out. And people get pushed out via taxes. People get pushed out via raised costs. People get pushed out via policy, because leaders get put into office who then create policies that favor the new residents, because the new residents are going to pay higher taxes. Like, it's going to reshape a lot of places. On the flip side, I was reading an article that said people will start to come back to those high tax cities, because there's still going to be a base there of opportunity and talent. And there are going to be people who got jobs during the pandemic with those companies, but they just haven't left where they are. And they're going to move there because they need to be closer to the main office. So I think it's going to reshape a lot of things in ways that we cannot predict. But I definitely think we're going to see all of the dynamics we've seen over the last 10 years that have played out in Seattle start playing out in Atlanta. I mean, it's already happening, right? Atlanta, Austin, Raleigh, Durham, Miami. Like, these are all the cities that they're talking about in the news. So yeah, it's 2021 is, I for the people who thought at the beginning of the year that all we needed to do was get out of 2020, I don't think they're ready for 2021. I would like to think it could be a 2020 redo, but I think it's going to be 2020 chapter 2 instead, not a redo.
I got an email, like an end of the year email from not a client, but like a contact of mine. And it was like, we made it. We did it. Like, it was a long, hard year, but you made it through the end of the year. And we're grateful. Like, 2021 is going to be better. To me, it's like, it's just a day. Like, it's, we're going to go from Friday to Saturday. And you might not, no one's going to forget that you're going to write /2021 because you're like, I never want to write 2020 again. But I think especially based off this conversation, there are a lot of things that are going to come to a head this year. And all of the things that we experienced in 2020 that we recapped today, like, there's repercussions of all of these things, right? Good and bad, that we have yet to deal with or even understand what's going to happen with those things. So I think that there's still a lot to come. This is how human history works, right? And there's ups and there's downs and things happen. And this isn't the world's first pandemic. Hopefully it's the last one for at least our generation in a long time. But it's gonna be a long one, and I'm really excited to go through it with you, Mr. Well Traveled, and have this show and be able to come back and like document and share some of our ideas and our opinions and our thoughts. Sometimes we're going to be right, sometimes we're going to be wrong, and address those things. And I appreciate you joining the show with me here this year and starting this was started as just like a crazy idea. And every time we'd have a conversation, I was like, we should have recorded that conversation. We think a lot of people could have gotten something out of it. And here we are now, episode 9 of Community as a Verb. And I'm really excited to continue the show with you.
Yeah, me too. I feel exactly the same way. I can't believe it. We're 9 episodes in. I remember when we were trying to just record the first 2. What I think most people wouldn't know is that there were actually 2 sort of test episodes before we actually recorded the very first one at the end of August, and it had to do with the fact that I just didn't feel like those episodes were that great, and to think where we are now, it's really amazing. And I'm very appreciative that you wanted to be on this journey with me, and that we're going to continue into 2021, because I really do think I think what I've learned in this time is that there's room for additional voices, right? We've talked so much about the media and the influences that we have, and while I think we have a small audience now, what I realize is that the people who have continued to follow us since August, they've really they have said to me that they've gotten value out of this, whether online or in person. People who've heard it said, "Wow, this was a good conversation. I learned something. It was an interesting perspective. I appreciate you sharing. Thanks for doing this." And so, I think there's more opportunity to continue that. I think there's more opportunity to, we've had some great guests on this show. I've really enjoyed talking with them, and I think we have the opportunity now to bring more voices to the table. And, we're all a part of this same community. We're all a part of a community of people on the planet. We're all part of a community of people in this country. And what happens in one part of the world, or what happens in one part of this country, it affects everyone. And so we talk a lot about Seattle, but the reality is a lot of what's going on in Seattle is reflected in other places, right? In other ways, Seattle is also like a crystal ball that, Ace talked about this, our guest last episode. He talked a little bit about the fact that Seattle kind of occupies this place between being years behind San Francisco, but years ahead of Austin. So if you're in Austin, where a lot of tech folks are moving from Seattle, from Los Angeles, from San Francisco, from New York, right? They're moving to Austin. Take a look at Seattle. Look at what happened the last decade here and see, that's what you're in store for. But also, being in Seattle, look at San Francisco and look at what's happened there the last decade and say, okay, this is what Seattle's in store for. So it's a really interesting time to be who we are and be where we are in the world. And I have appreciated the fact that you want to have these conversations with me specifically, to record them and to really share that with the world, because I know for both of us, that wasn't something we were doing before. And we've had lots of conversations about, how is this going to go? And what are we going to do in, this circumstance or that circumstance? And are we going to talk about this topic or not talk about this topic? And I think for me, it's been a really smooth process, and I've appreciated your support and encouragement, and, always, I was always kind of shy about getting on camera and about, really just opening up. And I feel like you always just said, it's okay, you got to do this. And I just appreciated the support and encouragement, because I feel like I've gotten to a very different place now that I'm doing this, and feeling in all ways like really very much like I do have something to say, and I have a perspective I want to share. And I also want to highlight others and bring stories to the forefront that maybe are getting pushed to the wayside or not even discussed at all. And I have appreciated that we've been able to do that and put that down in video form, in audio form, for people after us, other generations, to be able to pick up and do whatever it is that they feel like they want to do with it, whether it's inform themselves in the way that we've been informing ourselves with podcasts, or if it's simply, as a form of entertainment. I think what matters to me is that we've captured the time that we are living in, and that there are people who are both activists today who may gain something from this, but also people who will be activists in the future. Maybe someone who's born today on December 26th will listen to us, 20 years from now and feel like the same way we feel, that they have the ability to go out there and make a difference and take action in their own way.
I think that's a great place where to end the show. I think that's great. Thank you, everyone, for listening to episode 9 of Community is a Verb. Please like and subscribe, whether you're watching on YouTube or Apple Podcasts or Google or Spotify. You can find us on all those spots if you haven't found us there yet. And please go follow Mr. Well Traveled on Instagram. You can find me at Find Me in Seattle on Instagram as well. We appreciate you. We hope you have a wonderful celebration of the end of 2020. You can reflect on something positive that happened in your life. And we will be back in 2021 for episode 10 of Community is a Verb. See ya.